This morning, 1 Samuel chapter 23 is where we'll begin. In our study of 1 Samuel, right now where we're at is that David is still on the run from King Saul, and we're going to really be taking a look at 3 chapters. We're going to skip a chapter 25, and come back to it. And I'll explain a little bit about that in just a second. But the overall theme of this section is that David is seeking God while Saul is seeking David. So David is pursuing God's counsel and direction, and Saul is simply pursuing whatever he can that conserves his power, in this case killing David. He's seeking David and murder, while David is seeking God and the things of God. So there are basically 3 stories that we'll be looking at, and these stories, well, specifically the last of the 3 stories, the second and third story, share a number of similarities. So if you read 1 Samuel 24, and then you read 1 Samuel 26, these are almost the exact same chapter, with a few key differences in some of the details. And so it makes sense, as we're talking about it today, to kind of group 24 and 26 together. So we're not going to forget about Abigail there in chapter 25, or the death of Samuel as well in chapter 25, but we are going to just connect these chapter 24 and 26 together, and then next week, Lord willing, we'll get 25 and continue to move through the book. In all of this, what we're witnessing is this trajectory of David's development as the ideal king for Israel. And the kingship of David in the Bible functions not merely as David being this great king, or David being this man after God's own heart. As we know, David made a lot of mistakes, and we're going to talk about them. But really, certain aspects of David's heart and life and rule were interpreted by the people of God, inspired by the Spirit of God, to sort of be a prototype or a foreshadowing of a future king that would come. And so, as we'll see, I'll mention this morning in our sermon, but when the New Testament talks about Jesus, very often there is an emphasis that Jesus is, like Paul's going to tell Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 or 8, that Jesus is the offspring of David. It has nothing to do with he's from the tribe of Judah. Okay, there's a factor there. It has nothing to do with, he has royal lineage. There's a factor there too. But it's much bigger than that. It's not less than that. It's bigger than that, in that Jesus fills and fulfills everything that David as the ideal king embodied, and then so much more. So we're watching David be developed into this ideal king that would foreshadow the coming king, and so that's, there's a Christ-centered way in which we can read the life of David, in other words. Our story begins in chapter 23, verses 1 through 14, with David saving this place called Keilah. Now, this is a wonderful little 2 paragraphs. I want to read them for you, and then I want to just talk about how, to me, stunning this is. Now they told David, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors." Therefore David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, "Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." And David and his men went to Keilah and fought the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. I want to stop right there, just talk about what what transpires. To me, it's an amazing thing to read the opening lines of this chapter. Remember, David is on the run for his life. Literally, Saul has been bearing down on him, and he has narrowly escaped up to this point. And yet, David receives word. We're not really told who they are, but David receives information that this town in Judah, Keilah is an Israelite town in Judah, that this city is being attacked by the enemies of God's people, by the Philistines. And his response to that, they're fighting against Keilah, they're robbing the threshing floors. There's an injustice being done. David's response to that is to inquire of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? That kind of response does not make rational sense to us when you think about the situation that David himself was in. Right? It's not like David was sitting in his palace with a huge army and was saying, well, there's duty calls, I've got to go fight this battle. David's men have been, hiding in caves and wilderness, and they've been hungry. They've been in a lot of difficult situations. And David just gets a message that these people way over here, they've got a problem. And David says, well, maybe it's my job, maybe it's my calling to intervene in that situation. Sort of reminds me a little bit of the Good Samaritan, right? Who's walking down the road and saying, this is not my responsibility, and yet I'm going to make it my responsibility. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Any idea how many he had?
Well, we do know, I don't know how many men he has at this time. I do know that he had a few hundred back a couple chapters ago, or actually last chapter, chapter 22. Remember, all of the least of these were coming to David. He had people that were in despair, that were in debt, that were bitter in soul. He had all those people, and there were about 400 men. So he's got a few hundred men at this point. Now, things have transpired since then, but that's the idea. So this.
He asked God. He asked.
Sure.
He asked.
Yeah.
He didn't tell him. He asked.
Right. He did. He asked God, but he asked him with the intention to do what God said, right? Not as a way of sort of saying, well, I prayed about it, so now I don't have to do anything. He was saying, I'm ready if that's what you're going to call me to, and God said, I am. That kind of response did not make sense to David's men in verse 3. They use the life-preserving, human wisdom, pragmatic approach and say, we're afraid here in Judah. How much more if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Where we are is scary enough. Why would we go asking for trouble by taking a chance fighting another enemy, right? We've already got an enemy that's chasing us down. So why would we go, are we, glutton for punishment? Why would we go and do this again? But David goes back to the Lord. He says, okay, you got concerns. I'm going to take it back to God again. And he did not allow their doubts to dissuade him from doing what God had called him to do. And so he's going to go down and fight the Philistines. I think the point that I'd really like to spend a minute or two just chewing on here today, though, is that in this situation, David was not officially king of Israel. He was anointed by Samuel in private, but he was not inaugurated as king. Saul was still king. As long as Saul was alive, Saul was the king of Israel. So David is not in any way bearing the title or sitting on the throne of being the king of. He has no ring that says he's the king of Israel or crown. And this applies in a thousand ways. It doesn't matter what walk of life you're in, doesn't matter what your profession is, what your, if you're young, old, kids, no kids, grandkids, no grandkids. It doesn't matter. This principle applies to literally all of us. But David shows us here that it doesn't matter what your title is. Serve God in the ways that God calls you to serve Him, regardless of title, right? That you don't need to have the office in order to serve in a needed function in the world and in God's kingdom. David did not, well, okay, let me say it differently. David had a sort of guarantee in his life that he was going to be king, in that he had been anointed by Samuel, right? So he had some knowledge that there was going to be a day where he would officially become king. But we don't have to even have that guarantee that we will someday be officially recognized for whatever act of good deeds that we are doing or trying to do. Though in the end, we all know that we will be recognized by God, right? We know that that there's a day in which all things are revealed. But nonetheless, we trust that God is using us as much in what we do. Actually, let me say it differently. We trust that God is using what we do much more than God is using the title or recognition of what we're doing. So it's not so much, in other words, that David is not king of Israel, but he's acting like the king of Israel should act in this passage. And he goes and saves the people of God. You don't have to be in an officially recognized role to serve in a way that person would be, if that person was following God, they would do the things that you do. Let's just take an aside to look at the New Testament, what the New Testament says about like church leadership as just an example of this. But this applies to so many different walks of life. But if you notice in like sometimes they're called the qualities list, some people call them qualifications list, whatever, in 1 Timothy and in Titus for elders, nothing that Paul says is particularly like revolutionary in those passages, above reproach, and then a lot of details about what you might look for to determine that. If you read those lists, though, Paul is basically asking Timothy and Titus to identify the men in the church that are already doing the work of a shepherd, right? He's simply asking Timothy to look and see who is already a shepherd in the church and to recognize them as such. I think we may even have a copy. There's 2 volumes to this. I don't remember which copy we have in the library, but Lynn Anderson wrote a book on pastoral ministry, eldership. And the title of his book is called, or at least one of the volumes is called, They Smell Like Sheep. And the idea behind that is, and really that's the idea I think in 1 Timothy and Titus as well, is that Paul's message to them is not that they should go find a few men and tell them to go start smelling like sheep, right? He's supposed to find the men that already smell like sheep, right? That are already among the people doing the work of a shepherd, and to recognize them as such. So, just as a challenge to each of you, but maybe especially a challenge to the men of our congregation, don't wait until you become a deacon to do the work of a deacon. Don't wait till you become an elder to do the work of an elder, right? We want to be serving in those ways in order that we might perhaps someday be recognized for it, but that's really not the point. The point is that we see a need and we're stepping up to the plate, rising to the occasion in faith with trust in God to meet those needs. That's what David does here. These people are being attacked by the Philistines, and David has absolutely no obligation to go and bail them out while he himself is on the run. But he acts like the king should act and does what God's will is, regardless of who recognizes whether or not he is king or not king. Does it make sense what I'm saying? I mean, you follow that? Yeah.
Whether they should do it or not. And they went ahead on their own, and it was really a failure until they inquired with the Lord later on.
Yeah, and you know, the importance of being a leader who is seeking God, and not just in word but in reality, you know. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Mary?
I think it's wise to start with our little boys and our young men to maybe mentor them, both men in the church to mentor them and head them in that direction and have them look to that as the most wonderful thing that a man can do for God, you know, and you know, they get law is important, school is important, and but this is all a lot more important than anything in their lives. And so I think it's important to have men to mentor them. There's just so much women can do.
Well, but let's pull at that thread just a tiny bit more to say what we're trying to mentor young people toward ought to be the function rather than the title, right? And so whether that be male, female, whether we're thinking about some kind of church office or we're thinking about simply just being a Christian who is serving God, we really want to encourage our children and your grandchildren and really everyone in our church that it really isn't about, I really want you to be an elder when you get to be, you know, which is not what you're saying at all. Or, hey, if you want to be a deacon, this is why you need to live your life, you know. It's more, there is nothing better than to do the will of God. And whether or not that leads to you being in this title or that title, or it leads you to being the person who shows up all the time and is in the background and never gets any recognition, your life will never be better than when you're giving to the kingdom of God, right? And so there's that aspect here with David where he's going to go do what God wills, and recognition in his life does come, but it's a long time in coming. And you get the sense that David does not do this here because he says, when I'm king, they're going to tell this story. You know, I think he does it because he says, I think he has the same attitude that he has with Goliath. Remember his attitude? He says, this guy is running the name of my God into the dirt. Somebody has got to not stand for this, right? And so he takes his stones and so forth. You know the rest of the story. But well, in verses 6 and following, verses 6 and following, David is going to learn a difficult lesson. He may already know the lesson, but it's surely had to have been a painful one. Doesn't say that. I'm just reading between the lines. David seeking God again in verse 6, but he's seeking God to find the answer to a question. I don't know. I'm guessing that he's asking this question hoping for the other answer. When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Pause. Ahimelech was a priest we read about that got himself and all the priests massacred when he had given David the holy bread and inquired of the Lord on David's behalf. Saul finds out, is outraged, and Ahimelech's like, he's your son-in-law. He asked for my prayers, so I gave them. I don't know what the problem is. Boom, slaughtered them, slaughtered the people of Nob as well, or Nob. Well, Abiathar had gotten away from the massacre, and he had come down with an ephod in his hand. He was still ready to function as a priest, in other words. Now it was told to Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. And Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. The Lord said, He will come down. Then David said, Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will surrender you. And David and his men, Mary, we got the answer to your question here. David said to his men, who were about 600, so they've added a couple more, they arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition, and David remained in the strongholds of the wilderness and the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph, and Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. David took the initiative to go save these people from their affliction with no credit, with no credentials, simply acting in faith. And Saul's going to come down, and David asks Abiathar to intercede, and David asks God, will these men give me up to Saul? The people I just saved? And God says, yeah, they will. These are the kinds of, painful experiences that anyone who is serving God is going to encounter. You don't have to be in any kind of official capacity or church ministry. None of that really matters. Anyone that is serving God is going to have, and trying to be a godly leader is going to experience that kind of thing, right? Where you're trying to do God's will. In fact, in this case, you are doing God's will. Helping someone, and then circumstances change, and that relationship is severed like that. And it can be a painful thing. I have to think it would have been a painful thing for David as well. It's not so simple as the people of Keilah simply accepting David after he delivered them. But David and his men, they trust God's word to them, and they leave. And if you notice verse 14, Saul sought him every day. He was obsessed with David. He sought David as hard as David sought God, right? There's an aside here that is probably worth sharing, which is that everybody is seeking something, right? Everybody's seeking something. Everybody's looking to something, saying, if I just had that, then fill in the blank. For David, the answer was God. As the deer pants for water, so my soul longs for you. If I just have the presence of God, then I have everything I need in my life. Saul was looking at David and saying, if I can just get rid of him, then I'll have everything I need, at least for now. Everybody's searching for something, and you can be searching for God, and you can find strength to endure all kinds of difficulties even, let alone the joy that lasts on the good and the bad days. Or you can have your life consumed by searching after other things, and that's what's happening to Saul here. Saul sought him every day, day and night. He couldn't leave. any stone unturned. So we go then into this next section, which is, which is chapter 23 to the end, chapter 24, and then chapter 26. Saul is pursuing David, and he's going to end up encountering David a couple of times in the process. But in the pursuit, David is going to escape Saul in chapter 23, verses 15 through 29. Now, I won't read you this line by line just purely for the sake of time, but in verses 15 through 18, Jonathan finds out that David is in this wilderness. And Jonathan comes out to David and interacts with David again. He went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. There's like, between chase scenes, in the movie, there's like this little pause as Jonathan and David interact once more. And Jonathan, yet again, reassures David of his identity as God's anointed king, and by reminding him of his faithful love. Nevertheless, David is going to be betrayed by the people of Ziph. They, this is an area in Judah. They are going to tell Saul, David's hiding among, the hills, the rocks and everything out here in Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, which is south of Jeshimon. So they say, hey, come down. You can take him. He's here. So Saul's like, I've heard David is very tricky, very hard to pin down. You better make sure. So like, okay, we made sure you got the guy down here. So Saul is chasing down David. He knows where he is, and he's bringing his men. They're coming up on David in this story. This is verse 25. Saul and his men went to seek him, and David was told. So he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. So literally, it's like you're seeing Saul's men here, David's men here. David's men run over the side of the mountain. Saul's men are coming up the mountain. This is, they're breathing down their neck, basically. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place is called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. So, as Saul is closing in on David, there's this unwelcome announcement about the Philistine attack. So he has to leave David. He's got David, back against the wall, cornered, but he has to leave because there's a more urgent matter that he has to give his attention to. The reader of 1 Samuel understands that this is no mere coincidence, right? It doesn't say, then God caused the Philistines to attack. But the place is called the Rock of Escape because the idea is God delivered David from Saul's hand by means of what the Philistines were doing. So this is not a mere coincidence, but an intervention from God. And those acts of God are difficult to interpret perhaps in the moment. Like, I'm guessing that this Philistine raid that was happening, the people in that context had no idea that that was saving their future king's life by this happening in the moment. They can look back later and see that, but it just goes to show how difficult it is to fully understand what God is doing in the moment. It's something we see better in hindsight. Chapter 24 is, again, really similar to chapter 26. We'll see that. But this scene unfolds in En-Gedi, which is, I think, southeast of Jerusalem. Not that far. It's on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Bill Arnold, he points out that Saul's use of 3,000 infantrymen, which we would have read if we would have read all of that section, to try to subdue and kill a single man who had taken no meaningful steps toward harming Saul in any way, evidences his madness or his obsession. But what happens in this passage is Saul is looking for David, and he needs to relieve himself, to put it kindly. So he goes into a little cave so that he can have some privacy, the porta potty of the wilderness, a cave, I guess. And so he goes into the cave, he's going to relieve himself, and what he doesn't know is that back around the corner in the cave are all of David's men. They're literally right there. And you can hear them all breathing as quietly as they can. Don't let him. Well, the men of David in verse 4 said to David, and again, these stories are just so full of application. The men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterwards, David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Saul has no idea of anything that has happened. What I want you to notice about this story, what I want you to notice about this paragraph is that David's companions were completely right about the final outcome in this story. Saul was going to die. David was going to replace him. They were completely right about the final outcome of God's work in David's life. Perfectly true that David will become king and that Saul will die. But what you see in this story is that David is more concerned about how he will become king than when he becomes king. He's more concerned about how he will become king than about when he will become king. So David, despite all pragmatic wisdom, a wisdom that is becoming increasingly popularized in our own time, the ends for David do not justify the means and can never justify the means. So David looks at the situation and he says, "Far be it from me, the Lord forbid that I should take into my own hands the life of Saul, even though God's already promised that I would become king and already promised that he was going to end Saul's reign and, by extension, life. Far be it from me to do this thing without the Lord's direct command." But David has a moment of weakness before he fully comes to his senses there, right? He sneaks over and he cuts off a piece of Saul's garment. It's an act, not just, David didn't need a new square, like he was going to sew it onto his shirt or something. It's really a symbolic act that David was trying to accomplish there. Because the garment, the robe of Saul in this whole book has a symbolic function. Samuel has told Saul that his robe is going to be torn, right? Just like the robe was torn. His kingdom is going to be torn away from him. And it's really a metaphor in the story for Saul's fall from power. But notice in verse 5, that after David cut off the corner of Saul's robe, his heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He had not gone as far as his men had asked him in verse 4, but he knows that he has violated God's will even still. that he would attempt to send this message to Saul and take this piece of his robe. So convicted is David that in verse 8, he gets up and he goes out of the cave and he calls to Saul, "My Lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. Then David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'?" And he goes on, he proceeds to show Saul the piece of the garment and to say, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Don't you understand? See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. By the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I've not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." He goes on and he says in verse 14, "After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea." He says, look at my position right now. I'm doing nothing to you. I have very little. I've got a few men with me, but I have nothing. I'm a nobody. May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. Whereas Saul sees David as a rival to the throne, David views himself as a dead dog and a flea. In reality, both men see David properly, in a sense. David is a nobody. David is insignificant. He's Jesse's son from Bethlehem. He is not any kind of royalty as far as when he was born. He's certainly not even the most important person in his own family culturally. He was the youngest of the sons. And yet, God would elevate him to the highest seat of power in Israel. Why? Precisely because his heart struck him after what he did, right? Precisely because of the character of his heart. God said, "I found a person whose heart is after my heart. And therefore, I'm going to anoint him to be the next king of my people." In chapter 26, the same story happens, just in a different way. Again, the Ziphites come to Saul and they say, "David's hiding himself back over in these hills again. What are you going to do about it?" So they come down to try to find him. This time, David sneaks into the camp with one of his buddies, and they take from Saul Saul's spear and Saul's jar of water. By the way, that's how I know that David cutting the robe was not just him wanting to have a little show and tell. I could have killed you, but it had symbolic value because David's not cut to the heart about taking the spear. He's cut to the heart about cutting the robe. There's something in that message for David that crossed a line. Here, he takes this spear and this jug of water, and I've given you too many Lord of the Rings references in my life, so I'll spare you this one. But David stands up on a hill, and Saul's troops are, they're leaving the area, and David calls out to the commanding general, the highest military official in Saul's army, named Abner. And he calls out to him, and he basically calls him to account for the incompetency of his allowing Saul to be so exposed to David. And so he calls out to him from the hillside and says, "Will you not answer, Abner?" "Who are you who calls to the king?" Abner answered. And David said to Abner, "Are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king?" Anyway, he reveals the spear, he reveals the water jug, and again, just like in chapter 24, the story ends with Saul praising David for being righteous, for not attacking him. They're kind of separated by a distance here in chapter 26, but the point is, Saul says to David at the end of the chapter, "Blessed be you, my son David, you will do many things and will succeed in them." So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. This will be the last exchange that Saul and David ever have in their life. Saul will eventually go to his death from this point forward. But nevertheless, David's conviction is expressed again in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 26, and this is where we'll leave it today. David says to his friend Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." For David, it was always the right time to do what was right. He served regardless of official recognition or title. And he stayed focused on pursuing God regardless of the way that other people were focused on pursuing him or pursuing other things. When you think about David and Saul, what you see again and again is David insisting that how he would become king mattered more to God than when he would become king. David could have struck down Saul on a number of occasions, but he chose not to because for David, the ends, even though they're the right ends, David would become king. The ends don't justify the means. Serve God and wait for God to do in His time what God has promised to do. That would be the big takeaway, in addition to these three things, from the story of David. That's the time that we have for today. We'll look forward to talking about David and Abigail and some more next week. Thanks.